For a true empath, home is never just walls, furniture, or a physical space. It is emotional safety in its purest form. It's the one place where they can finally exhale without thinking, without scanning the room, without subconsciously absorbing the weight of everyone else's emotions. Outside, whether they realize it or not, they're constantly on. They're reading tones, sensing shifts, picking up on tension, decoding unspoken feelings. Even in calm environments, their awareness doesn't switch off. It's always working in the background, filtering energy that doesn't belong to them. And over time, that becomes exhausting. Because when an empath steps into the world, they don't just interact, they merge. They feel what others feel, sometimes even before those people fully understand it themselves. A simple conversation can leave them mentally drained. A crowded place can feel overwhelming without any obvious reason. Even being around people they care about deeply can take a toll, not because of anything negative, but because their system is constantly processing, constantly adjusting. But when they return home, everything changes. The noise fades, the emotional static disappears. There's no pressure to respond, no need to interpret, no hidden layers to navigate. It's the only place where their energy belongs entirely to them. They can sit in silence without feeling tension, think without interruption, feel without confusion. It's not just rest, it's restoration. At home, an empath reconnects with themselves in a way that's impossible in the outside world. They begin to notice their own thoughts again, their own emotions, their own needs, without them being mixed with anyone else's. It's like clearing a fog that they didn't even realize had built up. Their body relaxes, their mind slows down, and their awareness shifts inward instead of outward. And this is why they protect that space so fiercely. It's not about isolation or avoidance, it's about survival. Because without a place where they feel emotionally safe, grounded, and undisturbed, they begin to lose their sense of self. They become overwhelmed, scattered, and disconnected from their own identity. Home gives them that identity back. It allows them to reset, to recharge, and to exist without the constant influence of external energy. It's where they don't have to be the listener, the healer, the one who understands everyone else. It's where they can simply be. Because for an empath, home isn't just where they live, it's where they finally feel like themselves. One of the biggest misunderstandings about empaths who love staying at home is that people assume they're antisocial, distant, or uninterested in connection. But the truth is far deeper than that. Empaths don't avoid people because they dislike them. They avoid unnecessary energy exchange. For them, every interaction carries weight. Every conversation, every presence, every emotional tone requires processing. And over time, they begin to realize something most people never think about. Not every connection is worth the cost. Because to an empath, socializing isn't just talking, it's feeling. It's walking into a room and instantly picking up on tension between two people who haven't said a word. It's noticing the shift in someone's voice and knowing something is off, even when they say they're fine. It's sitting in a group and subconsciously absorbing the stress, the anxiety, the unspoken emotions circulating beneath the surface. And while others may leave a conversation feeling neutral or energized, the empath often leaves, carrying pieces of everyone else's emotional state. That's why they become selective. Not closed off, selective. They begin to choose where they go, who they spend time with, and how long they stay. Not based on convenience or obligation, but on how it affects their energy. They start realizing that some interactions leave them feeling calm, understood, and aligned, while others leave them drained, restless, and mentally exhausted. And once they become aware of that difference, they can't ignore it anymore. So they stop forcing themselves into spaces that don't feel right. They stop saying yes out of guilt. They stop engaging in conversations that feel superficial or heavy. They stop maintaining connections that require them to overextend emotionally just to keep things going. Not because they don't care, but because they've finally learned that caring for others shouldn't come at the cost of losing themselves. And this is where people often misinterpret them. From the outside, it looks like withdrawal, like distance, like disinterest. But in reality, it's self-awareness. It's an empath recognizing that their energy is not unlimited and that where they place it matters. They are no longer willing to invest in interactions that leave them feeling empty just to maintain appearances or meet expectations. Instead, they choose depth over quantity, meaning over noise, peace over constant connection. Because when an empath becomes energy selective, they're not rejecting people. They're finally choosing themselves. What most people don't realize is that an empath's need to stay at home is deeply connected to their nervous system. It's not just a preference, it's a biological and emotional necessity. Every time an empath steps into a busy environment, engages in multiple conversations, or absorbs intense emotional energy, their system becomes overstimulated. It's not always visible on the outside, but internally there's a constant processing happening, like too many tabs open at once, each carrying someone else's emotions, expectations, and energy. And over time that builds up. It shows up as mental fatigue, emotional heaviness, irritability, or even a sense of being overwhelmed without a clear reason. An empath might come home after what seemed like a normal day and feel completely drained, unable to explain why. It's not the physical activity that exhausts them. It's the emotional input they've been unconsciously carrying the entire time. That's why staying at home becomes more than comfort. It becomes regulation. It's how their nervous system resets. In the quiet of their own space, without constant stimulation, without emotional noise, their system finally begins to slow down. Their breathing becomes deeper. Their thoughts become clearer. The tension they didn't even realize they were holding starts to release. It's like their entire body is recalibrating, returning to a baseline that feels safe and stable. And this process can't be rushed. An empath doesn't just bounce back from overstimulation. They need time. Time in silence, time in stillness, time away from other people's energy. Even small interruptions during this recovery phase can feel overwhelming, because their system is still in the process of unwinding. This is why they often choose to stay home, even when there are invitations, plans, or expectations pulling them outward. It's not avoidance, it's awareness. They've learned, sometimes the hard way, that ignoring their need for rest leads to burnout, that pushing themselves to keep up socially can leave them feeling disconnected, anxious, and emotionally depleted. So instead of forcing themselves into that cycle, they choose to honor what their body is asking for. They choose to step back, to be still, to recover. And in doing so, they're not missing out. They're restoring themselves. Because for an empath, staying home isn't about escaping the world. It's about healing from it. One of the deepest psychological reasons empaths love staying at home is because it's the only place where they truly feel like themselves. When they're around others, even without realizing it, they begin to adjust. They mirror energy. They soften their tone. They shift their behavior to maintain harmony. It's not fake, it's instinct. They are naturally wired to adapt, to make others comfortable, to keep the emotional balance steady. But in doing so, they slowly move away from their own center. And the more they do this, the more subtle it becomes. They might laugh a little differently depending on who they're with. They might hold back certain thoughts to avoid tension. They might even take on moods that aren't theirs, blending into the emotional atmosphere around them just to keep things smooth. Over time, this constant adjustment creates a quiet disconnection. Not obvious, not dramatic, but enough that when they finally step away, they realize how much of themselves they were holding back. That's why solitude feels so different. At home, there's no one to mirror, no energy to match, no expectations to manage. There's no need to filter thoughts or adjust emotions. For the first time, everything becomes still enough for them to hear their own voice clearly, not influenced, not shaped, not diluted by anyone else's presence. And that clarity is powerful. They begin to notice what they truly feel, not what they absorbed. What they truly think, not what they adapted to. What they truly want, not what others expect from them. It's like reconnecting with a version of themselves that was always there, just buried under layers of emotional adjustment. This is where their identity strengthens. Because when an empath spends time alone, they're not just resting, they're realigning. They're rediscovering their boundaries, their preferences, their emotional truth. They start to understand who they are without the influence of others, and that awareness becomes the foundation of a stronger, more grounded self. And once they experience that level of clarity, it becomes hard to go back. Not because they don't care about people, but because they now understand the cost of constantly losing themselves and others. They realize that being around people should not require them to shrink, shift, or silence parts of who they are. So they choose solitude not out of fear, but out of self-respect. Because for an empath, being alone isn't about isolation, it's about finally being authentic. One of the most powerful psychological shifts in an empath's life is when they begin to value their peace more than their image. For a long time, many empaths live under the quiet pressure of being perceived a certain way, kind, available, understanding, easy to be around. They say yes when they want to say no. They show up even when they feel drained. They maintain connections not because they feel aligned, but because they don't want to disappoint anyone. But over time, something begins to change. They start to notice the cost of constantly being liked. The emotional exhaustion, the internal frustration, the feeling of being disconnected from themselves. They realize that trying to meet everyone else's expectations is slowly pulling them away from their own needs. And that realization creates a turning point, a moment where they begin to question whether being understood by others is really worth losing their inner peace. And that's when the shift happens. They begin to choose how they feel over how they're perceived. It's not loud, it's not announced. It's a quiet decision that reflects in small actions. They decline invitations without over-explaining. They stop forcing conversations that feel draining. They no longer stretch themselves thin just to maintain a certain image. And yes, sometimes people misunderstand. Some may think they've changed, become distant or less caring. But the empath sees it differently. They understand that protecting their energy is not selfish, it's necessary. That being constantly available doesn't make them more valuable. That saying no doesn't make them less kind. And most importantly, they realize that being at peace with themselves matters more than being accepted by everyone else. This is where staying at home becomes a conscious choice, not a default habit. It's where they can exist without pressure, without expectation, without needing to perform a role. It's where they can choose stillness over noise, authenticity over approval, and presence over performance. And while the world outside may continue to reward constant activity and social engagement, the empath begins to value something deeper: alignment. They no longer measure their life by how often they show up for others, but by how grounded they feel within themselves. And that changes everything. Because once an empath chooses peace over perception, they stop living for validation and start living in truth. One of the most overlooked reasons empaths love staying at home is because their inner world is already so full, so deep, and so active that they don't rely on constant external stimulation to feel alive. While many people seek noise, activity, and social interaction to fill a sense of emptiness, an empath often experiences the opposite. Their mind is always reflecting, processing, imagining, feeling. Even in complete silence, there is movement within them, thoughts unfolding, emotions being understood, insights forming quietly beneath the surface. And because of this, solitude doesn't feel empty to them, it feels complete. When they're at home, they're not bored, they're engaged in a different way. They might be replaying conversations, not to overthink, but to understand deeper layers. They might be sitting in stillness, yet feeling everything more clearly than they ever could in a crowded space. Their inner dialogue becomes richer, more honest, more aligned, when there's no outside noise interfering with it. This is where their creativity often lives. Empaths tend to have a strong connection to imagination, intuition, and emotional depth. In solitude, these qualities expand. They begin to see patterns, connect ideas, and gain clarity about their life, their relationships, and their direction. What others might see as doing nothing is actually a deeply active internal process, one that strengthens their awareness and sharpens their understanding of the world. And more importantly, this inner richness becomes enough. They don't feel the constant need to go out to be entertained or to be surrounded by people just to feel something, because they already feel deeply. They already think deeply. Their fulfillment doesn't depend on external validation or stimulation. It comes from within. That's why staying at home feels natural to them. It's not a limitation. It's alignment. It's choosing depth over distraction. It's choosing reflection over noise. It's choosing a space where their mind and emotions can move freely without interruption. And once they truly embrace this, they stop comparing themselves to those who thrive on constant activity. They no longer feel like they're missing out because they realize they're actually tuning into themselves, their thoughts, their truth. Because for an empath, the inner world is not something to escape from. It's where they feel most alive.